Okay, well, let's get started here with the new chapter on adolescence and work. We spent the last chapter talking about the role of school and education in adolescents' lives, and today we're going to take a look at how part-time jobs impact teenagers and then also how they choose more their occupation, their long-term jobs. So if we were together, we would be having a discussion, and this one always ends up being a lot of fun. I will ask you who had a job in high school and who did not have a job in high school. And then I'll ask you to think about how do you think that that affected you for positive or for negative? And how do you think that might have had an impact on your current career choice? So some of you would say, yeah, I had a job and I did this or that, and here's how it impacted me. And I'll share my own. I worked at the Golden Arches in high school for a couple of years, and the main impact it had on me, I'd already decided to go to college. It's not like it sealed the deal, and I had already decided on psychology, but the impact it had on me is that I knew that, number one, I didn't want to be managed. I didn't want to have a supervisor looking over my shoulder all the time, seeing what I was doing. And number two, I also didn't want to work in any kind of food industry where I had to come home and smell like a restaurant. And I also wanted a lot more independence. It's a highly structured job. And of course, in the career I have now, I'm very free, have lots of freedom to do basically what I want when I want it. I'm not heavily supervised. We have a supervision, but it's not like that. It's not involved in food. So it definitely had an impact. And I'm so curious as to what kinds of responses you all would have. And I thought about putting up a question on the discussion board, but then I thought, I realize that nobody just has time for that right now. So just imagine that we're talking about it. Hold on. So let's start by taking a look at the typical adolescent workplace and the kind of work that adolescents do. First of all, adolescents are working quite a bit. About a third of sophomores held some kind of part-time job, and 2/3 of seniors report that they've held some kind of part-time job. And that could be babysitting, it could be lawn care, it doesn't have to be, a job like at a restaurant or something like that. So adolescent employment in the United States is higher than in any other industrialized country, which I think is really interesting. And I suspect that's largely because of our individualistic mentality as a society, where teenagers are expected to pay for things that they want themselves and not necessarily rely so much on their parents. So other places where adolescents are employed, or places where adolescents are employed, young teens. Any guess what young teens' first job is? I really just gave it away already. For girls, it's typically babysitting, and for boys, it's most of the time yard work. Other adolescents, however, and especially once they get a little bit older, 13, 14, and they can actually legally work in kind of institutions, are working in restaurant and retail sales. And the average time worked we find for sophomores is around 15 hours a week. And for seniors, it's up to usually 20 hours a week. Seniors, of course, are usually fully able to drive and have transportation and can work a little bit more. So here are some more settings. Restaurant, retail. Other adolescents are doing clerical kinds of work. Some are doing manual labor, like working for a moving company or a construction company. Some are doing skilled labor, like carpentry or electrics or something like that. Now, the thing is, with the exception of skilled labor, the work done by adolescents generally is repetitive, it is monotonous, there really is very little challenge to it, and 25% of the time is spent cleaning objects or carrying things. The work is rarely related to school subjects. So I was thinking back to my time in McDonald's. I worked there a couple years, and their general rule is if you are not serving someone, you should have a towel in your hand and be cleaning something all the time. So given that this work is not really challenging for the most part, not gratifying, what's the effect of work on adolescent development? That's really the question that we're asking and what we'll address next. So we'll first start off with the effects of work on psychological functioning. Now, up to 10 hours a week, part-time work has very little effect on adolescent development or the development of problems. So the research has found really no issues, no problems for teenagers working below 10 hours a week. But beyond 10 hours a week, and especially over 20 hours a week, problems start to arise. And beyond 20 hours, those problems really do, we really do start to see some issues. And in particular, it's related to feelings of anxiety and depression, not necessarily clinically diagnosed, but teenagers really are struggling more with over 20 hours a week. And again, these are generalities due to studies. Maybe you worked 40 hours a week in high school or 30 hours a week and did just fine. That kind of thing always happens. There may be teens who are working just 10 hours a week and struggle. Some other things, after 10 hours a week, over 10 hours a week, it starts to affect teens' sleep and their eating and exercise habits, which of course are important just for overall health and wellness. And they found a little bit of differences, a few gender differences in terms of the stress that work causes. So for boys, they find that the stress at work, so things like pressure or work conditions or dealing with coworkers, was the thing most related to symptoms of depression and anxiety. So so what we're not sure of, hold on just a second. I had a page missing in my notes I needed to correct here. For girls, however, the stress and the problems come from the extent that school and work tend to conflict. So not enough time to do homework, not enough time to see friends. But there are some findings of the positive effects. There are some positive effects, learning new skills, those kinds of things. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a few minutes. So the schoolwork conflict is what leads to anxiety and depression for girls. Now, what about the work and problem behavior? What we know is that, again, that 10-week benchmark, adolescents who work, especially over 10 hours a week, are more likely to drink, use drugs, smoke, those kinds of behaviors. But our question is, which direction does this go? Does working lead to the substance use, or do kids who already use substance tend to get jobs more? So what direction does this go is really the question. There is evidence for both, but mostly the former. So it seems like the work environment is more likely to lead kids to substance use. And it makes sense. Those of you who had jobs when you were teenagers, you're usually working with older kids, you become friends with them, you become socializing with them, and then they're more likely to draw kids into using substances. This seems to increase as the number of hours increase. So the more kids work, the more likely this relationship is to be there. There is also a problem with something called occupational deviance among kids who work more hours. So think about the jobs you've had. Did you ever take a hamburger that you didn't pay for if you worked at a restaurant? Or did you ever take office supplies from a place that you worked? Those are examples of occupational deviance, deviant acts in the workplace, even calling in sick when you're not really sick. Adults do that too. But for adolescents, that's mostly characteristics of the workplace that could explain that. Your job is boring, it's most likely tedious, you don't have a feeling of personal investment, so a lot of kids just don't really care if they're fired. I remember when I was working at McDonald's, there was a guy there who got fired because he had a younger brother who was, we were 16, 17, he had a younger brother who was 6 or 7. And so it was found that he was stealing large amounts of Happy Meal toys and taking them home to his little brother. And so he got fired for that. So that's occupational deviance. Okay, now before we kind of go down the road a little bit too much with problems, there are some cases in favor of adolescent work. There are some positive things, and some people believe the case against adolescent work is really overstated and the benefits may actually outweigh some of the problems. So here are some examples of the positives teens get. They gain a sense of responsibility and money management. Many times that goes together. So they're responsible for getting to the job on their own and doing their work. And then this may be the only spending money they get, so their parents may put them in charge of that. You can develop social skills, and certainly anyone who has worked with the public or in customer service, you know that. And for a smaller number, about half, they will develop some new occupational skill. You can probably get an occupational skill out of any job you do, food service, not just money management, but maybe you're a team leader and you learn some leadership or some management skills. always working with the people and social skills are going to be helpful. Maybe you learn a new trade. And the other benefit is that adolescents who work spend much less time watching TV and playing computer games, which is really always a bonus. So to sum up, there are pros and cons for adolescents who work part-time. Most of the problems occur with over 20 hours a week. I know I've mentioned 10, but really 20 hours a week is that drawing line where we start to see problems. Okay, let's move away from just part-time jobs and talk about more long-term plans for adolescents and what kinds of things they're going to do as a career. We'll switch over to occupational choice. And the first thing I'd like you to do is to think about what kinds of things you wanted to be when you were growing up. At the beginning, we talked about part-time jobs, but what kinds of occupations were you thinking about and excited about? I know I wanted to be an astronaut at one point. I wanted to be a flight attendant at one point until I found out I was too tall. So what kinds of things did you want to be when you were younger, and what made you change that? And then I would also ask you, just for a survey of a raise of hands, how many of you were told when you were growing up that you can be anything you want to be? You can be anything you want to be. Do you believe that? I'm curious what your opinions are. We would probably get a variety of answers. The reality is probably a lot more kids would like to be athletes or veterinarians or marine biologists or whatever the most popular career choice is now than is possible. There are a lot of things that influence career choice, and as you get older you just start to become much more realistic about that. But the bottom line is that adolescents in our society do have a wide variety of possible occupations to choose from, and then once an adolescent makes up their mind, they hope it's going to be achievable. So we're first going to look at some of the ways that adolescents make occupational choices, and it's going to seem fairly straightforward. The main way that we choose what we're going to be are by personality characteristics. So this is really the main factor. And what we use in counseling and in career development is something called the matching model. And this is a very basic kind of model where you take a look at the personality characteristics of the person. So that would be what you're interested in and what your abilities are. And then you look for an environment that calls for those kinds of abilities, that needs those kinds of abilities. It's what we call the matching model. So for example, if you're really shy around people, sales is probably not going to be a good job for you. Perhaps counseling or something working with data and less so with people. So the matching model is just a simple, elegant, it's been around for about 40 years or so, and it's pretty straightforward. The main matching model that we use The leading theory that we use in the matching model in psychology is by a psychologist named John Holland. And Holland proposed that there are 6 different types of people and 6 different types of compatible work environments. And we can use the acronym RIASEC to remember these, RIASEC. And so I'm just going to plunge right into what these mean. As I'm going through each of these 6, I'd like for you to think about which one or two of these seems a lot like you and which one or two are really not like you. And I'm going to talk about that. So the realistic type, these are practical, hands-on kinds of people. They like to be outside. Compatible kinds of professions might be farming or construction, landscaping, firefighters, pipe fitters, HVAC, just basically anybody who likes to do things with their hands and work with things. The I is short for investigative. A lot of psychologists are investigative. These are people who like to solve problems. They like to think about problems. They're very curious. They tend to like science. They oftentimes will go into the computer field, math, and the sciences, engineering, of course, psychology. So these are people that just like to think and solve problems, the thinkers. The social area, of course, these are individuals that like working with people. They value an emphasis on verbal and social skills. So people will go often into teaching or counseling or ministry, social work, really even things like the law. So there's a pretty wide variety associated with the social field. The artistic folks, now these aren't necessarily people that can draw or paint or write or sing or anything like that, but they at least like that area and have an appreciation for it. So these are people that really like working with their imagination. They are more intuitive, tend to be more creative kinds of people. So go into things like design or painting or writing, and this could be engineering. Mechanical engineers, industrial engineers tend to be high on artistic designers. So there's lots of different fields here. The enterprising type, these are people who are very, very similar to social in that they like working with people, but they like to be in leadership positions and oftentimes like to be in charge. So they value verbal skills and social skills. Very commonly will do things like go into sales or management. Most politicians are high in enterprising. Most entrepreneurs, people that have their own business, are also very high in the enterprising. And then we have the last category, the conventional people, and these are people that like routine in their job. They prefer working with facts and data and structure more than people. So people certainly who go into banking or IT or accounting or clerical kinds of jobs, all those people would be considered to be high in the conventional. So think about which of these two sound a lot like you and which of these two don't sound like you. We'll take a look at these a little bit more deeply. Here's a chart here. So go ahead and pause the video, take a look at this chart, and get just a little bit more information about these kinds of backgrounds. The idea here is that most people are happiest if they're in a career that matches their personality. So, for example, I am high in social and I have like 0 in realistic. So if I were to go into these kinds of jobs, I would probably not be happy and I would probably not do very well. Versus a social kind of job or an investigative, I'm also high in, I'm going to do much better with that. Now we can take a look at this next chart here that gives us some good information. The RIASEC goes around I guess this is a hexagon for a reason, because types that are next to each other on the hexagon are the most similar to each other. So social people and artistic people have similar likes and abilities, and realistic people and conventional people are more alike in likes and abilities. But the ones that are opposite are opposite. So social people are very different than realistic people. Investigative people tend to be very different than enterprising people. So generally, if your top 2 codes, and there are tests that you can take to do this. If we were in class, I would give you one to take home. You can find them online too. If you just type in these 6 names, you'll find an online test. But generally the top 2, if they are close to each other, that leads to easier job choice for the most part because these jobs are similar. The tough thing comes if you have two really high codes as your top ones in opposite. So if you're really high in social and really high in realistic, well, the thing is, these are very different kinds of jobs. So you may be choosing from jobs as a social worker and jobs as a landscape designer. Those are very different. So you're going to have a lot more different jobs available to you, but sometimes teens have a harder time making a choice because they are so different. So the closer the letters, your top two letters are, that indicates more similarity. And it's also easier to make a choice if one or two of these are very high for you and the other ones are low. Because say if you're high in social and artistic and pretty low in the rest of these, that makes it easier because you know these aren't jobs you're going to enjoy and these are jobs you're going to enjoy. So if you find a job that's compatible with your personality type, you will be happier in that job, research finds, and you will also do a little bit better. Okay, so personality is just one influence on occupational choice. Another influence is family social class. There is a relationship between an adolescent's occupational goals and their family's socioeconomic status. So kids of higher socioeconomic status growing up tend to pick higher socioeconomic status careers, medicine, law, things like that, and then vice versa. So sons and daughter, kids of MDs, lawyers, and professionals generally aspire to similar things versus, for example, service occupations, similar kind of thing. So we have to ask the question, why is there a relationship there? And this is not 100%. We've got tons of kids from lower socioeconomic status homes who achieve very high in terms of these professions. But why in general is there a relationship? There are a couple of reasons. First of all, parents provide occupational models to the kids. If you observe your parent going to, let's say, an 8 to 4, a 9 to 5 job, and they come home and they never have to work at home, it's very much a go to your job and leave that kind of job. That's going to be the workforce that's represented to you. And that generally is the kind of workforce that you may aspire to. If your parent's job is helping other people, and that may not be 9 to 5, but they talk about that, that's going to make an impression on you also. So our parents provide occupational role models to us. The higher the socioeconomic status goes, the more resources are going to be available. So of course, more educational opportunities, more connections at professional levels. So that's something to think about. And then there is a relationship between parenting style. The research finds that middle class and lower socioeconomic status are more likely to use authoritarian parenting styles. So adolescents are more likely to select jobs that have aspects of conformity and following authority and following supervision versus upper middle class and upper class, that may be less the case. So I'm not putting a value judgment on any of these. I'm just saying that those are the role models that are represented. We know that the effect of parental socioeconomic status is weaker now than it is in the past. For example, we have a large African American middle class population that has developed in the United States over the last 40 years. So many young African American individuals have achieved a higher socioeconomic status than their parents. So that's the point I want to say, that this is certainly not a 100%. Okay, the last factor I want to talk about that influences occupational choice, less than it used to, but it still does, is gender. So if we're looking at some differences here, women are by and large more likely to go into the service sector to become teachers, nurses, secretaries, child care workers. This would include hospitality. And I don't know if you all have seen on the news, but during this coronavirus, the service sector are still working, with the exception of teachers, that are working from home. Nurses, clerical people in hospitals, housekeeping, cleaning, food service, those are all service sectors. Such a high proportion are women, and a high proportion of that are women of color or minority women. And so we see that those are the people that are putting themselves on the front lines right now. Very interesting. So women are more likely to go into the service sector where there is lower pay and lower benefits. Men tend to be more likely to go into sciences. This is no surprise to anybody. Engineers, surgeons, information technology. Now, when it comes to medicine, it's interesting because there are more women entering medicine than men, more women in medical school, more women entering the field of medicine. But women are more likely than men to go into pediatrics and family practice, which are lower paying and lower esteem aspects of medicine than, say, surgery. The top surgeons in this country, if you've seen any, watch any interviews for a period of time, they are more likely to be men. So even in professions where women are kind of seem dominant, the highest echelon, they tend to be men. I mean, even think about something like food service, cooks, chefs. The chefs that we see on TV with the TV shows and the ones that are highest paid, they tend to be men. So there's still this sex difference. Why do we see these differences? One of the answers is early socialization. Females are more likely to be not encouraged to go into the STEM fields of sciences, technology, and more likely to go into social service kinds of fields, teaching, service professions, teaching, things like that. Again, they are more likely to see role models of same gender behavior in disproportionate kinds of things. So females are more likely to see other females in service occupations. Males are more likely to see males in either labor kinds of positions or the technology. So socialization has a big impact. And then the sacrifice regarding family life is really important. If you think about it, it's usually, especially in the United States where we don't have great family leave acts, other countries, mothers and fathers, both parents, if there are two parents, get family leave act. That's not the case in the United States. We don't have a great family leave program, but women are more likely to make the career sacrifice regarding their family than men. So for example, if we've got two lawyers, if we've got a mom and a dad, let's say they're not related, the mom has a baby, she is more likely to take time off from work, to take extended time off. So when it comes time to make partners, she hasn't been able to put in the hours or the work time. The man, on the other hand, has not had to take that kind of leave, and largely, again, because it's not paid for in this country. So we've got a real problem and a discrepancy with that. But when women are more likely to make the exceptions for childcare and also childbearing, they are less likely to advance career-wise, and so that puts them a bit lower down. And then the last thing is, when it comes to the Holland's codes that we just talked about, some people argue that we don't really even need to take the test if we know your gender. Now, we know that gender comes on a spectrum, of course, but if you are on the binary, there seems to be some differences. So men tend to score highest on the realistic, the investigative, and the enterprising scale. Females are more likely to score highest on the social, the conventional, and the artistic scale. Lots of exceptions to this, but again, these occupations on the right tend to be lower paying and lower prestige than these. So that also accounts for the diversity. Okay, so we've covered a little bit of information, everything from part-time work to also how teenagers make full-time choices on careers.